Welcome back. Well, the monarchy in Eswatini appears to have been rocked by violent protests. Calls for a new democratic government by various groups there are gaining momentum. Some government buildings, several trucks, including some from South Africa, have been set alight by the ongoing pro-democracy protests. They escalated after the acting Prime Minister, Themba Masuku, issued a decree banning the delivery or handover of petitions to government officials and MPs. Well, we're joined now by Chris Maroleng, who's Executive Director at Good Governance Africa and a Swazi activist on the ground in Manzini, Mlungisi, Sibandze. I'm going to start with you, Mlungisi. Good evening to you, and thank you for your time on the pulse. What do protesters in Eswatini actually want?
Thank you for your time. The situation is, Swazis are tired of the system that is existing. Swazis want change. For the last 35 years, we've been living under King Mswati's rule. So people have noticed that the economy has been bad. We can't get new jobs. Unemployment has risen. So people, they just want to elect their own prime minister. Because before, the prime minister was elected by the king. So people want to be involved in those who can't bring them. So they want to choose their own prime minister. Also, they want the king not to interfere in politics, not to be there when making those decisions that really affect us. Because we find us biasness, because in most instances we find that we do not have full authority. Some companies don't have full control of the companies because the interference from the above. The power of the king will want shares on those companies.
Do you believe it will actually happen? I mean, the king has refused to allow political parties. He's refused to allow change. He's an absolute monarch. Do you think he'll allow any change?
Well, I'm hoping you guys can come to the international community, because since we really tried, right now nothing is happening in Swaziland. Where I am standing, we've got no water now, no shops are open, no petrol, no anything. We're hoping by shutdown, probably he will try to come down and have a conversation about this, not necessarily letting it go. So I'm hoping the international community will try to come through with those sanctions so that he doesn't have room to say no. Because the situation now on the ground is really, 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 really bad. It's really bad.
The situation in Eswatini is very different to us. If people here are angry about something, they phone a radio station, they they do all sorts of things, they tweet about it. In Eswatini, it seems that delivering a petition is important. Why is that so important? How does that process work? Why is it that when the government refused to accept a petition, that led to these protests?
I didn't get that question clear, but I think you'll talk about the petitions.
Yes. Why are the petitions so important that they've led to these protests?
Oh, okay. People, when they have voiced their concern, the acting prime minister told everyone that they must write something and send to their Inkundla, because of 52 Inkundlas in Swaziland. So that's what we did. People have written in their different Inkundlas, sending petitions to send their MPs, members of parliament, so that they can represent whatever they say in government. So the petition issue that now they have stopped the petition because people are going in large numbers there to petition the government. So the situation is like now we can't do anything because even the petition everyone has wrote in all 52 Ngudlas have wrote petitions, but none of them it's been action. And actually, it's just a similar statement that's on top of the statement. Election of the new of PM by the people. Then there was the other generals one. So the petition didn't work basically.
Mlungisi Sibandze, thanks very much indeed. A Swazi activist on the ground in Eswatini. Let's speak to Chris Maroleng, now Executive Director at Good Governance Africa. Chris, good evening to you. Thank you for your time on the pulse. We all know that King Mswati has never shown any intention of allowing democracy in the past. Do you think he'll change now?
Well, certainly, Stephen, the pressure is mounting for the monarch in Swaziland to consider introducing a more inclusive form of governance. And here, Stephen, I use my words very carefully, because the inclusive process of governance may not be as advanced or as progressive as what we understand here in South Africa and in other places as democratic governance. But if you listen carefully to what the people have been articulating, is that the governance processes within the Tinkundla system, which is the form of governance that occurs where people directly represent themselves at their local level, has not worked. And the main articulation here and what has resulted in this manifest discontent is that the Tinkundla system, as this process of governance, has fallen apart, and the people are now articulating in the mean for their concerns to be heard, and ultimately for the monarch and his political representative, the Prime Minister, to take forward their concerns and ultimately address them. So what we are faced with, Stephen, in reality, is a lack of legitimacy of the current administration in Swaziland because of this absolute monarchy that is currently in place. And I think what the people implicitly are saying, especially the more progressive elements in Swaziland, is that they want to transition towards possibly a constitutional monarchy. So what do we mean by this? We mean a monarchy that is not a power unto himself, absolute in all of his powers, but a monarchy ultimately that is constrained by the rules introduced by a constitution which in effect does not exist in Swaziland as we speak.
There's always, I mean, it doesn't matter what kind of government there is, if there's a move against it, protests against it, there's always this sort of window of difficulty. So the king might feel, let me give a little bit, let me reform a little bit, and that will actually ease the pressure. And in fact, what happens, East Germany is the best example of this, really. Communist countries that sort of changed from communism in the early 1990s. The little bit of reform actually led to more pressure building up. And that meant that in the end, those regimes fell. The king's now in that position, really, isn't he? He either cracks down really hard, risks bigger protests. He tries to give a little bit. That might lead to even bigger protests. It's a difficult situation.
Indeed. I think in game theory, the situation in which the king finds himself in is really a catch-22 situation where he's almost damned if he does and he's damned if he doesn't. Meaning that if the king accedes to the demands of the protesters, which is to introduce a more inclusive system of governance, democracy, and ultimately introduce a constitutional monarchy in which there is greater direct representation by the masses of the people, he risks ultimately being in that process, or seeing a situation where he loses this absolute power that he has. So in order for the king to maintain this absolute power, the question that must be in the mind of his advisors and indeed the monarchy is whether they are ultimately willing to use violence to suppress these calls for reform in Swaziland. Very difficult situation. We are hoping right now that the monarchy can see a middle ground, where ultimately at a stage there is a concession that there is need for reform. This reform leads to a process where the broad body politic in Swaziland can come together with elements from the monarchy to decide how that inclusive system of governance can be created for Swaziland.
There are going to be suggestions. I've already heard one or two calls for South Africa to intervene, for SADC to intervene. We've seen an intervention force being agreed to in Cabo Delgado in Mozambique. The difference, of course, is that the Mozambican government has said, please come. I don't see King Mswati saying, please come.
No, we don't see King Mswati at this stage saying, please come. However, Stephen, we cannot at this stage also rule out some kind of bilateral agreements. The king himself has close relationships with a number of leaders in the region. Interestingly enough, even with the president of Mozambique, and we could see maybe at a bilateral level some kind of intervention happening in Swaziland. This is speculative. However, if we look at the regional structure within Southern Africa, the Southern African Development Community, certainly this will be something that will seize their minds, and they could be preparing at least for some kind of political intervention to try and see if they can't bring the various parties together to arrive at some kind of understanding.
Chris, what does your gut tell you? Is this the beginning of real change in Eswatini, or is it going to go away?
This is the beginning of some process of, let's call it compromise, that should see the development of a new political system in Swaziland. It will not happen overnight, Stephen. However, if these protests continue and we continue to see this mass outpouring of grievance on the streets of Swaziland, we could very well brace ourselves for a very unstable situation continuing to unfold in Swaziland until this political compromise is arrived at.
Chris Maroleng, Executive Director at Good Governance Africa. Thank you. Mlungisi Sibandze, an activist in Eswatini. Really do appreciate the time.